The grand chamber of the Galactic Council stretched wider than any human structure ever built, its crystalline walls rising into a dome that seemed to touch the stars themselves through transparent panels overhead on Valori's Prime. The ancient, neutral world, where species came to settle disputes through words rather than weapons, or so the Council claimed when humanity first received their invitation 3 years ago. Ambassador Marcus Chen stood in the center of the chamber floor, his hands bound behind his back with energy restraints that hummed softly in the oppressive silence, surrounding him on all sides like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders and chest, making each breath a conscious effort. 12 towering seats formed a semicircle around him, each occupied by a representative of the ancient civilizations that comprised the Galactic Council, and each of those representatives looked down at Chen with expressions ranging from cold indifference to barely concealed contempt, as if he were something distasteful they had discovered on the bottom of their expensive footwear. The Archon, presiding over the proceedings, raised one of its 4 slender arms, and the chamber fell into absolute silence, so complete that Chen could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like distant drums echoing across a battlefield he had never wanted to fight upon, but found himself standing in nonetheless. Ambassador Marcus Chen, of the species-designated human from the world called Earth. The Archon's voice resonated through translation devices that rendered its words into every known language, simultaneously creating an eerie chorus effect. You have been brought before this council to answer for species-level crimes against galactic order and the established peace that has endured for 7,000 standard cycles before your kind reached beyond your small blue world. Chen lifted his chin and met the Archon's multifaceted eyes without flinching, because whatever happened next, he would face it as humans had always faced the darkness, standing upright and refusing to bow to those who demanded submission through fear rather than earning respect through actions. The charges. The Archon continued while gesturing to a holographic display that materialized in the air between them, showing images of human colony ships and military vessels and construction platforms are as follows. Unauthorized expansion beyond designated territorial boundaries in violation of Council Decree 47,012. Development of prohibited weapons technologies in violation of the Civilized Warfare Conventions. Refusal to submit technological development to Council oversight committees for approval before implementation. And most grievously, the assertion that your species possesses sovereignty equal to that of Council member civilizations. Despite lacking the wisdom, age, and cultural development necessary for such status, the charges were exactly what Chen had expected, because he had warned Earth's unity government that the Council would never accept humanity as equals given their rigid, hierarchical view of the galaxy, where ancient species ruled and younger ones obeyed without question or complaint. How do you answer these charges? Archon demanded. Chen took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the vast chamber, reaching not just the Council members but the thousands of observers from dozens of species who had come to witness what they assumed would be humanity's humiliation and surrender. I answered that these charges are based on laws humanity never agreed to follow, restrictions we never consented to accept, and a hierarchy we never acknowledged as legitimate. Chen said, and he saw several Council members shift uncomfortably in their seats at his defiance. Humanity claims the same right every species in this chamber exercises, the right to determine our own future, to expand our civilization as we see fit, to develop technologies we deem necessary for our survival and prosperity, and to govern ourselves without interference from those who view us as children. Requiring their guidance, the Vexian representative, a massive creature resembling an insectoid warrior from human nightmares, slammed one of its chitinous limbs against the arm of its seat, creating a sound like a gunshot that echoed through the chamber. Your arrogance knows no bounds. Human. The Vexian hissed through its translator. We who have sailed between stars for millennia while your ancestors dwelt in caves do not require lessons in civilization from an infant species that has barely left its cradle and already threatens the peace we have carefully maintained. Chen smiled without humor, because the Vexian had just revealed the truth underlying all of this. The Council feared humanity not because humans were dangerous, but because they were different and refused to accept the status quo that kept ancient species in power while younger civilizations remained forever subordinate, then this council has already decided my fate, Chen observed. So let us dispense with the pretense of justice and proceed to whatever punishment you have prepared. The Archon gestured again, and the holographic display shifted to show the sentence written in stark characters that needed no translation. Execution by disintegration. To be carried out immediately and broadcast across the council space as a warning to any species that might consider following humanity's example. Felt his heart rate spike but kept his expression neutral, because he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear in his eyes. During these final moments, the sentence will be carried out now, the Archon announced, while a platform rose from the chamber. Floor beneath Chen's feet, lifting him higher so that all could witness clearly. Let this serve as a lesson to humanity and all younger species. The Council's authority is absolute, and those who defy it face only one outcome. Energy crackled around the platform as the disintegration field began to activate. And Chen knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before the field reached lethal intensity, so he activated the subdermal transmitter Earth's intelligence services had implanted beneath his skin before this diplomatic mission began. His final message transmitted directly to Earth through quantum-entangled communication that could not be intercepted or blocked by Council. Technology in his words were simple and clear. Don't mourn me, Chen said, while looking directly into the recording devices capturing this moment for posterity. Make them remember me. The disintegration field reached full power in Ambassador Marcus. Chen ceased to exist in a flash of light that illuminated the entire chamber, while 12 species congratulated themselves on maintaining order and never suspecting they had just made the worst mistake in galactic history. 10,000 light-years away in the war room, buried deep beneath Earth's unity, Government Headquarters Fleet Admiral Sarah Kozlov watched the execution broadcast on a dozen screens while her staff stood in shock. Silence around Hershey did not cry or rage or make dramatic pronouncements because there would be time for emotion. Later, after the work was done instead, she turned to her communications officer and gave the order that would change everything. Send the activation codes to all fleet groups, Kozlov said in a voice like ice grinding against stone. Operation Remember begins now. Across human space, from the shipyards of Mars to the construction platforms orbiting Jupiter's moons to the hidden military bases scattered among the asteroids, and the colonies on distant worlds, the message arrived simultaneously, and humanity's war machine roared to life. Like a sleeping giant awakened by fools who mistook its patience for weakness. The Council had sent their message, but they were about to receive a reply written in fire and steel, and the absolute conviction that no human would ever again kneel before those who demanded submission rather than offering respect. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity had known since the first. Human looked up at the stars and dared to dream of reaching them. That those who mistake restraint for weakness and diplomacy for surrender learn their lessons in blood and ash and ruins that stand as monuments to their fatal arrogance for generations yet to come. The Council's intelligence networks had been monitoring human activity since first contact 3 years ago, when a human exploration vessel stumbled into Council space, and humanity learned they were not alone in the universe, as they had long suspected, but never confirmed until that fateful day. What the Council's observers saw appeared to confirm their assessment of humanity as a typical young species. Industrial development on multiple worlds, expanding colonial efforts, growing trade networks, and military forces that seemed adequate for system defense but hardly threatening two civilizations that had mastered interstellar warfare millennia before humans discovered fire. What the Council's observers failed to see was everything that mattered, because humans had learned long ago that showing your enemies your full strength before the battle begins is how you lose wars before the first shot gets fired deep beneath the lunar surface, in facilities that appeared on no official records and consumed enough power to light a small city. Human engineers and scientists had been working 20-hour shifts for 3 solid years developing weapon systems that would make the Council's fleets obsolete overnight. Dr. Jennifer Zhao stood in the primary research bay of Facility Darkside, watching the final test of the kinetic kill vehicle designated Hammer 7 and feeling a mixture of pride and horror at what her team had created the vehicle was deceptively simple in appearance. A solid tungsten rod 10 meters long and half a meter in diameter with a basic guidance system and minimal propulsion capability that could accelerate it to 0.95 light speed before impact firing. Solution locked. Her chief engineer reported from the control station while checking readouts on multiple screens. Target is the abandoned mining station in Sector 77 Alpha at a range of 4.3 astronomical units. Fire when ready. Authorized and tried not to think about what this weapon would do to a populated world if the Unity government ever gave that order. The magnetic accelerator hummed with building power and then released Hammer 7 in a fraction of a second, sending it hurtling into the darkness at a velocity that turned it into something more than a weapon. It became a fundamental force of nature that nothing in the Council's arsenal could stop or deflect for. Hours later, the abandoned mining station simply ceased to exist as Hammer 7 struck with the kinetic energy equivalent of several hundred nuclear weapons, releasing it all in a microsecond that vaporized metal and rock and everything else in a sphere. Hundreds of meters wide, direct hit. The engineer confirmed unnecessarily because the explosion had been visible even without instruments. As a brief new star born and dying in the same instant, penetration exceeded all projections and the guidance system maintained accuracy despite relativistic effects. Zhao nodded and made notes while already thinking about the next test because Hammer 7 was just one component of humanity's hidden arsenal and not even close to the most terrifying weapon they had developed during these 3 years of apparent peaceful diplomatic engagement in orbital facilities around Jupiter, where the gas giant's radiation belts provided natural interference against long-range scanning. Programmers worked on swarm AI systems that made the Council's cyber defenses look like children's toys compared to military-grade encryption. The swarms were elegant in their simplicity. Millions of semi-autonomous drones, each no larger than a human fist, working together with emergent intelligence that allowed them to adapt and evolve tactics in real time based on enemy responses. Captain Michael Torres commanded the test fleet that would face the swarm's latest iteration in a wargame scenario designed to simulate Council defense patterns based on intelligence gathered through diplomatic channels and espionage operations. All ships report ready, his tactical officer announced while the fleet of 20 vessels arranged themselves in the standard Council defensive formation that prioritized overlapping shield coverage and concentrated firepower. Swarm launch detected at bearing 270, Mark 15, at a range of 50,000 kilometers. Torres watched his displays as the swarm approached, like a glittering cloud catching sunlight off millions of tiny metallic surfaces, creating an almost beautiful effect that disguised the lethal purpose driving each individual unit. Though fleet's AI-controlled defense systems opened fire with laser arrays and kinetic point defense weapons, destroying hundreds of drones in the first seconds, but the swarm merely adapted, flowing around the defensive fire like water around stones and finding gaps in coverage that shouldn't have existed according to Council tactical doctrine. Within 3 minutes, the swarm had penetrated the fleet's defensive perimeter, and individual drones began attaching themselves 2 ship holes where they deployed cutting tools that sliced through armor plating with terrifying efficiency, while others targeted sensors and communication arrays and weapons emplacements. Fleet combat effectiveness down to 40%. The tactical officer reported with clear amazement in his voice. And we haven't destroyed even 10% of the swarm's total mass. Torres called an end to the exercise before the swarm could completely disable his ships, but the message was clear. The Council's vaunted military forces would face an enemy they had no doctrine to counter and no experience to draw a opponent. Biological research stations hidden among the asteroid belt, where official records listed only mineral processing operations. Scientists worked on projects that made even the military officers overseeing them uncomfortable despite understanding their necessity. Council consisted of 12 distinct species, each with unique biochemistry and physiology that had evolved on different worlds under different conditions, creating vulnerabilities that a species skilled in biological sciences could potentially exploit. Dr. Milano Conquo stared at the sealed containment unit holding samples of what his team had designated Agent Whisper and wondered if humanity would ever forgive him for creating it if they survived long enough for history to judge his actions. The Vexian test subjects showed 98% mortality within 72 hours of exposure. His assistant reported while reviewing data from the isolated testing facility on a distant moon where the Council would never think to look. The agent remains dormant in human systems and can be keyed to activate only in the presence of Vexian. Genetic markers. Okonkwo nodded because that was the terrible genius of Agent Whisper. It turned humans into plague carriers who could walk among the Vexian population completely unaffected while spreading death to every Vexian they encountered. Until entire worlds fell silent, similar agents existed for each Council species tailored to their specific biology and ready for deployment if the Council pushed humanity into a corner where such weapons became necessary for survival. But the crown jewel of humanity's secret arsenal existed in a research station orbiting Neptune, where the solar system's edge provided maximum distance from prying eyes, and quantum physicists had achieved what Council science insisted was impossible. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the martyred ambassador, stood in the observation gallery watching the final calibration of the quantum entanglement, communication, and munitions system that would give humanity faster-than-light strike capability, the Council's FTL. Technology was faster than anything humans had developed, allowing their ships to cross vast distances in days rather than the weeks human vessels required, but their weapons still traveled at sublight speeds. During combat, creating predictable engagement ranges and tactical limitations, humanity's new system changed everything. By using quantum-entangled particles to transmit targeting data and trigger mechanisms instantaneously across any distance, allowing weapons fired from one location to detonate at another location, light years away with zero transit time. Entanglement stability holding at 99.7%, Chen's lead physicist reported. We can maintain coherent links across distances up to 500 light-years with current hardware. Chen authorized the test firing and watched as a missile launched from the Neptune station in 3 seconds. Later, a target buoy in orbit around Proxima Centauri, 4.2 light-years away, simply exploded as the warheads quantum entangled. Trigger received its activation signal. The implications were staggering. Human forces could strike Council targets from positions of complete safety, making retaliation impossible, and defensive planning meaningless. Admiral Kozlov received reports from all these facilities and dozens more scattered across human space while she planned the operation that would demonstrate to the Council the fatal error they had made in executing Ambassador Chen. They think we're children playing at war, Kozlov told her senior staff during the final planning session before Operation Remember commenced. They've enjoyed 7,000 years of peace, enforced by technological stagnation and strict weapons limitations that kept warfare civilized. According to their definition of the term, she pulled up holographic displays showing Council fleet dispositions and defensive installations and trade routes and civilian population centers scattered across their territory. The Vexian Imperial fleet had patrolled the approaches to their homeworld for 3,000 years without ever facing a serious military threat because the Council's dominance was so complete that even thinking about challenging their authority seemed like madness to most species. Commander Zixthar stood on the bridge of the dreadnought, inexorable, watching routine patrol patterns on tactical displays, while mentally composing the reports that military bureaucracy demanded even when nothing of significance occurred. During a shift, the first indication that this day would be different from the previous 1,000 came when every sensor array on every ship in the fleet simultaneously registered massive energy signatures appearing at the edge of the system, multiple contacts emerging from FTL. The sensor operator reported with confusion evident in the clicking patterns of Vexian speech. Configuration unknown. Transponders not broadcasting Council identification codes. Count as 300 and rising. Zixthar felt the combat instincts that had lain dormant for his entire career suddenly awakening as he stared at the tactical display showing more and more hostile contacts, appearing from hyperspace in a coordinated emergence pattern that spoke of careful planning and precise execution. Sound general quarters and raise shields, he ordered while activating the fleet-wide command channel. All ships assume defensive formation Delta 7, and prepare for possible hostile action. The human fleet finished its emergence maneuver and hung in space 50 million kilometers from the Vexian homeworld, while Admiral Kozlov reviewed the tactical situation from her flagship's Combat Information Center. All strike groups report successful transition, her operations officer announced. 0 losses during emergence, and all weapons systems show green across the fleet. Kozlov nodded and activated the communication system that would broadcast her message on every frequency. The Vexian fleet was monitoring Vexian forces. Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty and cold fury that had been building since she watched Marcus's Chen die. You are hereby notified that a state of war exists between humanity and all Council member species effective immediately. In response to the unlawful execution of Earth's diplomatic representative, she paused to let that information sink in before continuing. You have 1 hour to evacuate all civilian populations from military installations and withdraw your forces beyond the orbit of your 4th planet? Kozlov stated, failure to comply will result in immediate and overwhelming military action against all legitimate targets within this system. Zixthar listened to the human ultimatum with disbelief that quickly transformed into rage because no species had dared threaten the Vexian Empire in recorded history, and certainly not some upstart civilization that had barely achieved interstellar. Flight transmit response, he ordered. Inform these humans that the Vexian Imperial Fleet does not negotiate with criminals and that they have one opportunity to surrender before we demonstrate why the Council has maintained peace for 7 millennia. The human response came 30 seconds later, not in words but in action, as the first kinetic kill vehicles launched from human ships and accelerated to combat velocity faster than Vexian sensors could track properly incoming projectiles. The sensor operator called out, velocity exceeds 0.9 light speed and impact predicted in 17 minutes across multiple fleet elements. Zixthar ordered evasive maneuvers, but the math was unforgiving. Ships traveling at sublight speeds could not evade projectiles moving at relativistic velocity when the flight time was measured in minutes. First hammer struck a Vexian battlecruiser amidships, and the kinetic energy release was catastrophic, turning 200,000 tons of military spacecraft into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma that engulfed 3 nearby vessels and damaged a dozen. More direct hit on the relentless tactical reported unnecessarily because everyone on the bridge had witnessed the explosion. Total loss, with no survivors and significant collateral damage to supporting units. More impacts followed in rapid succession as human kinetic weapons found their targets with precision that spoke of excellent targeting data and weapon systems designed specifically to defeat. Council defensive Mesoresixthar watched his fleet being systematically destroyed by an enemy that remained far beyond the effective range of Vexian weapons, while his tactical officers frantically calculated firing solutions that might allow them to return fire. Launch all fighters and order the fleet to advance at maximum acceleration, he commanded. We must close the range and bring our weapons to bear the Vexian fighters. Launched in swarms of thousands, while the capital ships began their advance, but the humans had anticipated this response and deployed countermeasures that turned the Vexian attack into a nightmare. Drone swarms emerged from human carrier vessels in clouds so dense they registered on sensors as solid masses, and the AI controlling them had been programmed with one mission: destroy everything that wasn't. Broadcasting human identification codes, the Vexian fighters met the drone swarms at the halfway point between the two fleets and discovered that numerical superiority meant nothing against an enemy that could adapt tactics in real time and coordinate actions across millions of individual units. Fighter pilots who had trained for years in simulated combat found themselves facing opponents that learned from every exchange and shared that knowledge instantly with every other unit in the swarm within minutes. The Vexian fighter screen had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing back toward their capital ships, while the swarms continued their advance toward the main fleet. Fighter losses at 70%. Tactical reported with shock evident in every clicking syllable. Remaining units are unable to establish effective defensive perimeter. Zixthar made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, assuming he survived the next hour. All ships execute emergency FTL jump, he ordered. Retreat to Rally Point Gamma and await reinforcements. But the humans had planned for this contingency as well, and as Vexian ships began spooling up their FTL drives, they discovered that the space around them had been seeded with quantum disruption, mines that made hyperspace transitions impossible without risking catastrophic drive failures. FTL drives are being blocked by some kind of interference field, the engineering officer reported. Attempting to bypass, but the effect is widespread and appears to be intentional. Kozlov watched the Vexian fleet's attempted retreat fail and knew the moment had come to demonstrate humanity's full capabilities, all ships. She broadcast on the fleet command channel, execute bombardment plan Alpha, and maintain fire until targets are neutralized or surrender is offered. The human fleet opened fire with every weapon system they possessed, and the Vexian formation disintegrated under a barrage that combined kinetic weapons and energy weapons and swarm attacks and cyber warfare that penetrated Vexian networks and turned their own systems against them. Ixthar saw his flagship's shields lapse under sustained fire and felt the deck shudder as human weapons tore through armor plating that was supposed to withstand anything short of stellar. Radiation shields down to 15%. Damage control reported. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12 and main reactors showing instability. He looked at his tactical display and saw that more than half the Vexian fleet had been destroyed or disabled in less than 30 minutes of combat against an enemy that had suffered exactly 0 losses. Transmit surrender. Zixthar ordered while feeling shame burn through him like acid. Form the humans that we yield and request terms. Kozlov received the Vexian surrender. Felt no satisfaction in victory, only grim determination to see this war through to its conclusion. Ceasefire. She ordered, deploy boarding teams to secure surrendered vessels and begin damage assessment. The battle for the Vexian homeworld had lasted 37 minutes from first contact to surrender, and when the casualty reports came in, they showed that humanity had destroyed or captured 2/3 of the Vexian Imperial fleet, while suffering losses so minimal they barely. Registered news of the defeat spread through Council space at the speed of light as surviving Vexian ships transmitted. Warnings about the human attack and the impossible weapons they deployed, and the speed with which they had destroyed what was supposed to be the Council's primary military force in Valoria's Prime, in the Council chambers where Marcus Chen had been executed less than 48 hours earlier. The 12-member species convened an emergency session to discuss the crisis. The Archon, presiding over the meeting, looked at reports from a dozen different sources, all confirming the same terrifying mentor reality. Humanity had just demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded Council projections by orders of magnitude. How did we not know about these weapons? The Zelthian representative demanded while its tentacles writhed with agitation. Our intelligence networks have been monitoring human activity since first contact. They showed us what we expected to see, the Archon replied, and we were arrogant enough to believe it because we assumed no young species could pose a genuine threat to civilizations as ancient as ours. The Vexian representative, speaking from a bunker deep beneath their homeworld's surface, added a note of desperate urgency. The Zelthian consortium had not achieved their position as the Council's premier trading civilization by being stupid or inflexible, and when they saw what humanity had done to the Vexian Imperial fleet in less than an hour, they immediately began calculating the cost-benefit analysis of continued resistance. Ambassador Trellix sat in his private quarters aboard the consortium's flagship watching intelligence reports about human fleet movements and realized that humanity was not simply fighting a war. They were systematically dismantling the Council's ability to project power across the Galaxy 3. Human task forces were advancing on different vectors toward major Council worlds, while smaller raiding groups struck at supply depots and communications relays and trade hubs in a coordinated campaign that demonstrated strategic planning far beyond what the Council had anticipated. They are not behaving like a young species throwing a tantrum, Trellix observed to his senior advisor. They are prosecuting this war with the efficiency of a civilization that has spent millennia perfecting the art of organized violence. His advisor's skin pigmentation shifted to colors, indicating agreement. In concern, the other Council members refused to acknowledge this reality. The advisor said, They continued to speak of humanity as if they were rebellious children who need to be disciplined rather than a peer-level threat that could destroy us all. Trellix made a decision that would either save the Zelthian consortium or condemn him as a traitor, depending on how events unfolded. Open a secure channel to the human fleet command. He ordered, "Inform them that I wish to discuss terms of surrender and am prepared to offer significant concessions in exchange for the preservation of Zelthian sovereignty." The transmission reached Admiral Kozlov 6 hours later, and she read it with her senior staff while they debated the appropriate response. It could be a trap. Her intelligence officer suggested, "Yes, the Zelthians are known for their manipulative diplomatic tactics." Kozlov considered this, but rejected the conclusion because the intelligence they had gathered about Council internal dynamics suggested that fractures were already forming in the coalition. No. She decided, they're pragmatists, and they can see that we are not interested in symbolic victories or limited objectives. And they want to save what they can before we finish what we started. She authorized a response that was broadcast not just to the Zelthians, but on every council frequency to ensure all member species heard it clearly. Ambassador Trellix. Kozlov's message began, "Humanity acknowledges your request for negotiations, but we must inform you that we do not accept partial justice or selective accountability." She paused to ensure the translators had time to render her words accurately. Every member of the council watched as Ambassador Marcus Chen was executed for the crime of defending his species' right to self-determination. Kozlov continued, "Every member voted to approve that execution or remain silent when their voices might have prevented it. And silence in the face of injustice is complicity." The final portion of her message sent shockwaves through council space. "Therefore, we do not negotiate with individual council members seeking to preserve themselves while sacrificing others," she stated. "We demand unconditional surrender of all council leadership, complete dissolution of the council's authority over member species, reparations for the families of those killed in this conflict, and the establishment of a new galactic assembly based on actual democratic representation rather than the oligarchy you have maintained for millennia on Valoris Prime." The council chambers erupted into chaos as member species turned on each other, with accusations flying about who had pushed for Chen's execution and who had supported the decision and who had remained silent when they should have spoken. The Archon tried to maintain order, but found that authority built on 7,000 years of unchallenged dominance crumbled quickly when faced with an enemy that refused to acknowledge that authority as legitimate. The Zelthians betrayed us. The Vexian representative snarled while displaying aggressive postures that in better times would have been considered inappropriate for council proceedings. They attempted to negotiate separately and save themselves at our expense. The Vexians led us into this disaster. The Zelthian representative countered, "Your arrogance convinced the council that humanity would submit to our authority, just as every other young species has done, and now we all face extinction because you could not imagine that someone might refuse to bow to your supposed superiority." The Archon watched the coalition dissolve before its eyes and knew that the council had already lost this war, even if military defeats had not yet reached their homeworlds. Meanwhile, human intelligence operations were conducting a different kind of warfare that proved just as devastating as kinetic weapons. Commander Lisa Park coordinated cyber operations from a secure facility on Mars, where human hackers worked around the clock to penetrate council communication networks and extract the data that would destroy the council's carefully maintained image. "We have full access to the Archon's private communication archives." One of her team leaders reported tens of thousands of messages between council members, discussing their manipulation of younger species and their contempt for the civilizations they claimed to protect. Park reviewed samples of the intercepted communications and felt disgust at what she read, because the council's public face of benevolent guidance masked private conversations filled with cynical calculations about how to keep lesser species dependent and compliant. "Release everything," Park ordered, "broadcast it on every frequency and transmit copies to every independent news organization and government and council space." The data dump hit the galactic information networks like a tsunami, washing away decades of carefully constructed propaganda. Species that had believed the council represented enlightened Governance discovered that council members privately referred to them as useful resources to be exploited civilizations that had accepted subordinate status thinking it was necessary for galactic peace, learned that the council deliberately suppressed technological development among younger species to maintain their own dominance. Worlds that had sent tribute to council members for generations found out that those resources had been used not for collective benefit but to maintain the luxurious lifestyles of council. Elitsa reactions were immediate and explosive on the Regelian colonies where humans had made first contact with species other than council members. Protests erupted demanding independence from council oversight. The Centauri Federation, which had been a council protectorate for 500 years, declared unilateral independence and expelled council representatives from their territory. Dozens of other civilizations began similar movements, while the council's ability to respond was paralyzed by the human military campaign that kept their forces pinned at defending core territories. At Maril Kozlov watched the council's empire crumble from within and recognized that humanity's greatest weapon was not kinetic kill vehicles or drone swarms, but the simple truth revealed to populations that had been manipulated for generations. The council maintained power through perceived invincibility and moral authority, she explained to her staff. We destroyed their invincibility at the Vexian homeworld, and now we have shattered their moral authority by revealing their hypocrisy. Her operations officer pulled up a tactical display showing human fleet positions. Relative to Council Core worlds, we have clear paths to the Archon homeworld and the Zelthian primary colonies. He reported resistance has been minimal because most Council forces are in disarray following the rebellions on subjugated worlds. Kozlov studied the display and made the decision that would end the Council's existence as a galactic power prepare for final operations against Valerie's Prime. She ordered, "We end this where it began, in the chamber where they executed Marcus Chen." The human fleet entered the Valori system 3 weeks after the war began and found the once proud neutral world in chaos. As council members attempted to evacuate while their former subjects rioted in the streets demanding justice, the Archon's personal guard made a token attempt at resistance but surrendered within hours when human forces deployed overwhelming force backed by ultimatums promising destruction of evacuation ships if resistance continued. Admiral Kozlov personally led the boarding party that entered the council chambers and found the Archon sitting alone in the presiding seat as if waiting for judgment. Fleet Admiral Sarah Kozlov of Earth. The Archon's translator rendered its words with what might have been resignation. "I assume you have come to complete your species' vengeance?" Kozlov looked at the alien that had presided over Marcus Chin's execution and felt not hatred but cold satisfaction at justice delivered. "I have come to inform you that the Galactic Council is hereby dissolved by military force," she stated. "You and all surviving council leadership will stand trial for crimes against sentient species, judged by a tribunal that includes representatives from the civilizations you exploited." The Archon's multiple eyes regarded her with what might have been curiosity. "And what makes you think your judgment will be any more just than ours?" asked. 6 months after Ambassador Marcus Chin's execution, the war was over, but the work of building something better from the ashes had only begun. Fleet Admiral Sarah Kozlov stood on a balcony overlooking the rebuilt council chambers on Valori's Prime, where the first session of the new Galactic Assembly would convene in 3 days, and she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Like a physical burden, the chamber below had been modified extensively. The 12 towering seats, where council members had looked down on lesser species, were gone, replaced by a circular arrangement of equal height. A seating for representatives from 43 civilizations, including the former council members who had survived the war. "It looks more like the United Nations than the Roman Senate now," Captain Torres observed while standing beside Kozlov and watching construction crews make final preparation. Kozlov nodded, because that had been the intention, creating a structure where no species held permanent authority and where decisions required consensus rather than dictates from those who claimed superiority through age or technological advancement. "The hard part was not winning the war," she said. "The hard part is building something that lasts and prevents future conflicts While respecting the sovereignty of species with vastly different cultures and values and historical experiences, Torres gestured toward the memorial visible. Through the transparent dome overhead, a massive crystalline monument engraved with Marcus Chen's final words in every known language. Surrounded by the names of all who had died in the war, both human and alien at least, we ensured he will be remembered. Torres said Kozlov thought about the cost of that memorial measured in lives and resources, and the scars that would take generations to heal. The trial of former council leadership had concluded 2 weeks earlier in this same chamber broadcast. Across the galaxy, so that all could witness justice delivered through due process, rather than summary execution. Archon and surviving council members stood accused of crimes against sentient species. Systematic exploitation of younger civilizations. Deliberate suppression of technological development. Manipulation of trade to benefit council members at the expense of others. And the execution of a diplomatic envoy whose only crime was defending his species' sovereignty. The tribunal consisted of judges drawn from species that had suffered under council rule and from neutral civilizations that had no stake in the outcome, and even from humanity. Despite objections that victims should not sit and judge, Enkozlov had testified about Earth's perspective and the events leading to war, while carefully avoiding inflammatory language that might turn the trial into a revenge proceeding rather than a legitimate examination of crimes and responsibilities. The Archon's defense attorney, a human lawyer from Earth's unity government, had argued that the council acted according to laws and customs that had governed galactic relations for millennia, and that judging them by standards they did not accept was itself a form of tyranny. My clients believed they were maintaining order and preventing chaos, the defense attorney stated. They believed that restricting younger species' technological development prevented wars, that their authority was necessary to preserve peace, the chief judge, a Rigelian who had witnessed both council oppression and the liberation humanity provided, responded with words that would be quoted for generations. Believing that your oppression is benevolent does not make it just, the judge said, in claiming that peace maintained through subjugation is preferable to freedom accompanied by risk. Is the philosophy of tyrants throughout history. The tribunal found the former council leadership guilty of most charges and sentenced them to imprisonment rather than execution, because, as the judge explained, we will not compound the crime of Marcus Chen's execution by engaging in the same disregard for justice that characterized Council Rule. Kozlov had mixed feelings about the verdict because part of her wanted harsher punishment for those who had killed Chen, but another part recognized that building a better galactic order required demonstrating that justice could be achieved without vengeance. The reparations imposed on former council species were substantial, but not crippling. Technology transfers to help rebuild worlds damaged in the war, educational exchanges to share knowledge that the council had hoarded, and financial compensation to families of those killed in the conflict. The real change came in the structure of galactic governance itself. The new Galactic Assembly operated on principles that humanity had learned through millennia of political experimentation: no permanent members with veto power, decisions requiring supermajority votes on significant issues, regular elections of leadership positions, most importantly, a charter of rights that guaranteed every species sovereignty over their own development and expansion. It is not perfect. The Assembly's first elected president, a Centauri diplomat named Kelthor, Kay admitted during the opening ceremonies, but it is built on the recognition that no species has the wisdom to rule others and that legitimate authority comes from consent rather than power. Kozlov attended the ceremonies in dress uniform, alongside representatives from Earth's unity government, and felt pride mixed with exhaustion from the months of negotiations and compromises required to reach this point. Dr. Jennifer Zhao sat in the audience, remembering the weapons she had helped create and wondering if humanity would ever need to use them. Again, Captain Torres thought about the battles fought and the lives lost, and hoped that the Assembly would make such conflicts unnecessary in the future. Commander Lisa Park considered the intelligence operations that had helped destroy the Council's credibility and reflected on the power of truth as a weapon against oppression. They all carried scars visible and invisible from a war that should never have been necessary. but that had taught the galaxy lessons it desperately needed to learn on. Earth in the Unity Government's Memorial Garden, a new monument stood alongside tributes to those who had died. In humanity's long history of conflicts, Marcus Chen's statue depicted him not in death, but in life. Standing tall with one hand extended in greeting in his expression, showing the mix of hope and determination that had characterized his approach. To diplomacy, his daughter, Maya Chen, stood before the statue, wearing the uniform of a junior officer in Earth's diplomatic corps because she had chosen to continue her father's work, believing that the best way to honor his memory was to build bridges. Rather than burn them, Admiral Kozlov found her there during a rare visit to Earth. Between assignments, he would be proud of you, Kozlov said while standing beside Maya and looking up at the statue. Maya smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. Would he be proud of what happened after? She asked. The war and the deaths and the destruction, even if it led to something better? Kozlov considered the question carefully before responding because it was one she had asked herself many times. During sleepless nights aboard her flagship, your father believed in diplomacy until his last breath. She said he tried everything possible to find a peaceful solution, and only when the Council made clear they would accept nothing but humanity's submission did he accept that force might become necessary. She put a hand on Maya's shoulder. We tried to follow his example, Kozlov continued. We gave the Council every opportunity to choose differently, and we built something better from the ashes of their empire. And we ensured that his sacrifice led to lasting change rather than temporary vengeance, Maya nodded. And wiped her eyes. He told me once that the hardest part of diplomacy was knowing when to stop talking and start acting, she said. And that those who mistake patience for weakness force others to demonstrate the difference. Kozlov agreed because that wisdom had guided humanity's response to Jin's execution. The galaxy had learned what humanity had tried to teach. Peacefully, that sovereignty was not granted by ancient civilizations to younger species, but was an inherent right of all sentient beings. That authority without accountability was tyranny, regardless of how benevolent it claimed to be. That those who demanded submission rather than offering respect created enemies who would eventually possess the
strength to hold them accountable, and
that sometimes the only way to achieve lasting peace was to fight. One terrible war that made future conflicts too costly to contemplate. 6 months after Marcus Chen died on Valerie's Prime, the galaxy was fundamentally different. The Council was gone. New democratic structures were emerging, former subjects were becoming partners, and humanity had established itself as a civilization that would defend its principles with diplomacy when possible and force when necessary. Fleet Admiral Sarah Kozlov returned to her flagship and prepared for the next mission because even with the war over and the assembly functioning, there remained countless challenges ahead. But as her ship accelerated away from Earth toward the frontier where human colonies continued expanding and new species awaited first contact, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had done what Marcus Chen asked in his final words. They had made the Council remember him. The galaxy would never forget the ambassador who died defending his species' freedom, or the civilization that refused to let his death be meaningless.